Mike Scott's quiet life is shattered when fake HOA officers show up, threatening to cut his power unless he cleans up his property. Their arrogance and false authority ignite his fury, but little do they know, Mike isn't just any ordinary citizen. He controls the state power grid. What happens next is a stunning twist that flips the tables completely, turning their intimidation into their downfall. But just wait until you see how it all ends, with justice served in the most unexpected way. Mike Scott had always prided himself on living a simple, peaceful life in suburban Oregon. His days were predictable, quiet mornings spent sipping coffee on the porch, afternoons spent tending to his garden, and evenings in front of the TV, nothing extraordinary. It was the kind of life most people dreamed of, the kind you worked for to escape the chaos of the world. Nothing out of the ordinary ever seemed to happen here, and that was how Mike liked it. But then, one crisp fall morning, everything changed. Mike was trimming the hedge near his front door when he noticed two men walking up his driveway. They weren't the usual door-to-door salesmen or delivery people. No, these men were different, dressed in matching dark blue uniforms that looked strikingly official, with patches that read HOA enforcement stitched onto the sleeves. Mike's stomach turned slightly. Homeowners associations. He had never had to deal with them, and he never thought he would. As they approached, one of the men smiled stiffly, his expression cold and businesslike. The other held a clipboard, his eyes scanning the front yard with a judgmental gaze. "Mr. Scott?" the first man called out in a tone that was somehow both polite and stern. Mike looked at him, his heart racing for reasons he couldn't quite explain. "Yes," he replied, wiping his hands on his pants and standing a little straighter. "Your property doesn't meet HOA standards," the man continued, his voice flat. "Your lawn's too messy and your windows need cleaning. We've received several complaints, and if these issues aren't resolved, we will be forced to take further action." Mike blinked, trying to process what he was hearing. "I'm sorry, complaints? From who?" His voice had a nervous edge, though he was trying to stay calm. His lawn wasn't perfect, sure, but it wasn't anything outrageous. And his windows? They had a little dust. Big deal. "We don't disclose personal complaints," the man said, his smile not reaching his eyes. "But if you don't make the necessary changes, we'll be forced to cut your power until these issues are corrected." Mike's mind went blank. Cut his power? For what? For a few blades of grass that hadn't been trimmed to perfection? For some dust on a window pane? Before he could respond, the second man stepped forward, holding up a flimsy-looking document. Mike could hardly believe it as the man presented it to him. An official-looking notice from the HOA, complete with a seal that seemed entirely too professional to be real. "Here's the notice," the man said, pointing to the document. "You have 48 hours to comply. After that, we'll initiate the power shutdown." Mike's breath caught in his throat. He stared at the paper, trying to make sense of the situation, but it felt like a nightmare he couldn't wake up from. This couldn't be real. He hadn't signed up for anything like this. His mind raced. Were these men even with an actual HOA? Was this some kind of scam? His voice shook when he finally spoke. I don't know who you are, but you don't have the authority to come here and demand things like this." The first man's face hardened. "We do have the authority, Mr. Scott. You can either fix it or face the consequences. The choice is yours." As they turned to leave, Mike stood frozen, unable to comprehend what had just happened. His peaceful life had just been interrupted by people who, as far as he could tell, had no legitimate right to dictate anything about his home. His heart pounded in his chest, the anger rising as he realized the full weight of the situation. This wasn't just about a lawn. This was about control. And Mike Scott wasn't about to let anyone control him. Mike stood in his driveway, the morning air cool against his skin, but inside him, there was a storm. The two men in the fake HOA uniforms had left, their hollow threat still echoing in his mind. As he watched them walk away, his chest tightened, and an overwhelming sense of injustice surged through him. How dare they? Who were these strangers to tell him how to live? To decide what was right for his property, his life? Mike's anger flared as he looked at his lawn, which was nothing more than a few blades of grass slightly overgrown. Hardly a crime. And his windows? A little dust wouldn't hurt anyone. But to have two people come onto his property, to have the nerve to threaten to shut off his power because of something as trivial as that, it felt like an invasion, a slap in the face. He turned his gaze to his neighbors' homes, hoping for some sign of support. But the quiet suburban street, which had always felt like a haven, now felt suffocating. His neighbors had all seen the men too, but none of them said anything. No one stepped up, no one challenged the intruders. Mike's stomach churned. Why was everyone so afraid? It was the same in every neighborhood. It seemed like everyone was too terrified to speak up, to fight for their rights. They followed the rules blindly, obeyed every little demand, and never asked questions. It was as if they were conditioned to fear authority, to submit. And that's when it hit him. They weren't just after his lawn, they were testing him. The thought gnawed at him. How many others had they done this to? How many people were too scared to fight back? Mike wasn't one of them. He wasn't going to let some fake enforcers dictate how he lived his life. A dark determination settled over him. Mike knew the system inside and out. He wasn't just some regular guy they could bully. For years, he had worked on the state's power grid. He understood it better than most people realized. He had managed critical systems, dealt with outages, coordinated restoration efforts. He knew the ins and outs of the infrastructure like the back of his hand. This wasn't a random threat. This was something he could fix. The knowledge flooded him, and with it came a rush of adrenaline. He wasn't going to let them shut him down, literally or figuratively. No, Mike wasn't going to sit back and let these people think they could control him. They had no idea who they were messing with. He took a deep breath, the weight of the situation settling in. This was more than just a power struggle. It was a matter of principle. He had been pushed, and now it was time to push back. Mike turned toward his house, his mind already racing. He needed to get to work. The power grid, his knowledge, his experience, it would be his weapon. He wasn't about to be bullied into submission. They had threatened him, but they had no idea who they were dealing with. With his hands clenched at his sides, Mike made a decision. This time, the ones who thought they were in control would learn what happens when you mess with the wrong person. Mike's blood was boiling. The thought of those two men standing on his property, throwing around their hollow threats, it was too much to bear. Every time he replayed the moment in his head, it fanned the flames of anger. Who did they think they were? But more than that, it wasn't just the men in their fake uniforms. It was what they represented, a system that trampled on people's rights, a system that expected compliance without question. He had had enough. The quiet, polite resistance that everyone around him had shown was no longer enough. Mike's heart pounded as the adrenaline surged through him. His fingers itched to take action, to show those men that he wasn't the one to be messed with. He turned to his desk. His laptop sat there, unassuming, but it was his key. His mind raced as he recalled every system he had worked with, every line of code, every network protocol he had studied. He wasn't just another frustrated homeowner. He was an expert in the very system they thought they controlled. Within moments, his fingers were flying over the keys, and the complex systems that regulated the state's power grid became his target. He wasn't some inexperienced hacker fumbling around in the dark. He knew the grid inside and out, and he knew exactly where to strike. His screen flickered, a surge of commands running through his system. His fingers paused for just a moment as he thought about what he was about to do. But then he didn't hesitate. Let's see how they like it. Mike hit the final key, and just like that, the power grid began to respond. One by one, systems began to shut down. The hum of the servers, the flow of electricity, all of it faded like the flicker of a dying light. Within minutes, not just his home, but several blocks were plunged into darkness. It was a blackout, a calculated move, a move that would make them understand the weight of their actions. He leaned back in his chair, his breath shallow as the reality of what he had just done settled in. He had taken it too far to turn back now, but there was no doubt in his mind. He had made his point. Outside, the street was silent, save for the occasional rumble of distant generators struggling to fill the void. The lights of his neighbors' houses were gone, their quiet streets now eerily still. A few minutes ago, this had all seemed like a normal, suburban neighborhood. Now it felt like a battlefield. Mike's pulse was still racing, the feeling of power, real, unfiltered power, coursing through him. He felt alive, and for the first time in what felt like forever, in control. He hadn't just reacted, he had struck back, and he couldn't help but smile at the thought. What would those men do now? How would they respond when they realized that the very thing they tried to control was now beyond their reach? Mike's fingers rested on the keys again, a new wave of determination settling in. There was more to be done, but for now he just let himself savor the moment, the taste of victory. The knock at the door came later that evening. Mike had expected it, but even so, the sight of those two men standing on his porch gave him a rush of satisfaction. The fake HOA officers were back, their faces flushed with frustration, their uniforms still as hollow as the threats they'd made hours ago. But now they were the ones in the dark. Mike had already turned on the porch light, just enough to cast a shadow across his face. He stood there, arms crossed, his posture relaxed, but with an air of quiet authority. He let the seconds stretch out, savoring the moment, before he spoke. "So," Mike said, his voice steady, "what's your next move?" The men exchanged a glance, their nervousness evident. They weren't sure what to make of the situation. It was clear now that they weren't in charge. Not here, not anymore. One of the men, the taller one, was the first to break the silence. He stepped forward, his voice shaky. You can't just interfere with the power grid like that. You've broken the law." Mike's smirk grew. "You're right," he said, deliberately drawing out the words. "I did break the law, but the thing is, I'm not just some random guy you can push around. You came to my home, tried to control my life, and now, here we are. Looks like the tables have turned." The men looked around at the surrounding houses, the blackness stretching in all directions. The street was eerily quiet, not a single light in sight, except for Mike's. The houses they'd once thought of as their territory, where their power would go unchallenged, now sat under a thick, oppressive silence. They hadn't just threatened one man, they had disturbed a whole neighborhood. Mike felt a small thrill at seeing their discomfort, but more than that, he felt a sense of pride, not because he'd taken the power away, but because he'd shown them something they had no control over: resolve. "Why don't you go ahead and try calling your backup?" Mike continued, his smirk still in place. "Let's see if they can fix this." The men stood there, speechless for a moment, before they finally turned and walked off, muttering under their breath. Their plan had backfired, and it was clear they knew they had no power here, not anymore. As Mike watched them retreat into the dark, a wave of satisfaction washed over him. He had done more than just resist. He had struck a blow to a system that thought it could trample over the rights of ordinary people, that believed they could manipulate others with threats and lies. And now it was all on the table, exposed. But more than that, Mike realized something. The real victory wasn't just in the act of retaliation. It was in showing everyone, including his neighbors, that sometimes the most powerful weapon wasn't physical force or verbal conflict. It was standing your ground and showing others how to stand up for themselves. He had taken control not just of his home, but of the moment. And in doing so, he had set an example. A lesson that sometimes the biggest fight was not one that could be fought with words alone. It was the fight for one's dignity, for one's right to live freely, without fear of intimidation. Mike's smirk faded into a quiet satisfaction. The feeling of power, the control over the situation, was his to keep. And for the first time in a long while, he felt like he was exactly where he needed to be.